in Africa's most industrialized economy. Then Ghana's economy has also been taking a bashing recently. Will a $3 billion facility from the IMF put the second largest economy in West Africa back on the path of redemption, or is the situation much worse than we know? And less than 24 hours ago, the U.S. Federal Reserve has raised interest rates yet again. We find out what the impact it could have on the economies of the continent. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Let's start with the African business headlines. The Nigerian government says British and Irish businessmen it accuses of fraudulently winning an $11 billion arbitration award previously used the same playbook to net a cash settlement from Africa's largest economy. President Muhammadu Buhari's administration is preparing for a trial in London early next year where it aims to prove that Process and Industrial Developments Limited, PNID, secured a gas supply contract and the subsequent arbitration victory through bribery. Now, the government is expanding its offensive against the firm to include claims about its shareholders' role in the dispute with the state that was also marred by corruption allegations. PNID denies all allegations of wrongdoing and accuses the Nigerian government of evading its legal obligation to compensate the British Virgin Islands registered company. Construction work in the Lekki Deep Sea Port, the biggest seaport in Nigeria, has been completed. A major step towards the country breaking through a bottleneck in international trade and achieving accelerated economic growth. Now, according to China Harbor Engineering, the port's builders, the Lekki Deep Sea Port, with a berthing depth of 16.5 meters and a total investment of $1 billion, is the first deep sea port in the country. It will be able to handle 1.2 million containers annually, increasing the country's container handling capacity by up to 80%. Currently, Nigeria relies on two old, overcrowded ports whose shallow waters are unable to dock larger vessels, greatly restricting the scale of imports and exports. In East Africa, Kenya's national carrier has unlocked 2.5 billion shillings in annual savings starting next year after negotiating lower charges on a leased fleet of aircraft. The airline says it has negotiated the reduction of aircraft leasing costs by 21% as it continues with the restructuring program that targets bringing down its high-cost base, mainly the high fleet ownership expenses. KQ's target is to cut its overall cost by 8 billion shillings, or about 10% of the airline's total operating expenses of 79.9 billion shillings as of 2020. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has promised in late July to implement energy and emergency measures within 3 months to tackle record blackouts. But those have only been partially implemented and the outages have continued. The president's spokesperson, Vincent Magwanya, says the president plans to deal with energy-related issues when he addresses Parliament in Cape Town today, but he declined to comment on the specifics. Eskom has increased its maintenance budget by 9% for the 2023 financial year, and it could rise by a further 5% in 2024, pending various approvals. The company said the move will let it focus on critical activities needed to improve the performance of its power stations. And staying in the region, Zambia's power utility ZESCO says there will be no load shedding in Zambia, emanating from low water levels at the Kariba Dam. ZESCO said that the existing generation capacity can provide consistent power to local consumers. This comes after the Zambezi River Authority said that water levels at the dam are falling to record low levels at 10.9% usable water last week compared to 34.1% a year ago. Levels are close to those reached in the 1995-96 season, the lowest recorded since the dam was completed in 1959. When we come back after this quick timeout, a strike is looming and it could be the mother of all strikes for South Africa as the government has rejected the workers' demands and there might not be a consensus on a compromise. The conversation after this. South Africa may need to brace for the disruptions and challenges that come with strikes after public sector workers announced plans to embark on a mass-scale industrial action following the collapse of wage talks with the South African government. The government has offered a 3% wage increase and a cash gratuity of between 1,000 and 1,200 rand to its workers, but failed to turn things around. South Africa's public staff believe they deserve more. Now, some unions have suggested a 10% hike to help their members stay ahead of inflation, which is high at 7.5%. The South African government doesn't have much leeway. If they agree, it will put a dent in their plan to reduce the country's debt and rein in government spending. But if they don't, the resulting strike will ground the country's economy to a halt. Development economist Palisa Nkomo joins me now to get into this issue. Palisa, welcome again to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, good morning, Tolu, and good morning to the listeners.
We've spoken about a lot of strikes in South Africa this year, Eskom, Transnet, as well as strikes at private companies. But at the end of the day, what we see is that some of these strikes have been quite successful for the strikers. For instance, the Eskom strike resulted in a 7.5% pay bump. And then, of course, we also saw what happened with some of the private entities as well. Do you think that this is one of the reasons we might be seeing the threat of the strike from the Public Servants Association, the success of the previous strikes this year? Is it contagious?
Perhaps let me just first paint the picture that when the economy is actually in such an ailing state as South Africa, right, we are currently being projected to grow the economy at about 1.1%, which initially it was about 2.1%, according to IMF data. So what it means is that, in fact, the economy cannot afford any form of strikes, right? But at the same time, on the back of this is that we've been exposed to macroeconomic austerity measures, which amongst those is increase in interest rates. So meaning that the workers, by the way, are actually losing money from the interest rate increases. So in essence, the demand for increase in wages, there's a lot of legitimacy into it, because it means that whatever they were taking home last year is actually being taken away this year by the interest rate. So their conditions of living are being affected. And this cuts across public sector, Eskom workers, whether it's transport sector, etc. Of course, the public sector strikes, as development economists, we're really nervous about it, because we know that it will actually cripple the economy even further, because the essential services are very critical for this country to run. If police, for example, go into strike, it means that crime could just be rampant. If nurses go to strike, it means that people who are not well will not be treated. And obviously, if you don't have access to primary health care, it means that you're not going to be able to lead, a healthy, productive life and lead a well-productive life in essence. So the reality is that the well-being of citizens is so much linked to actually the public sector strike. So, and that's why, our call with other several economists has been that we plead for the government and public sector to go into the table. But there's something we must also raise, though, is that we think that public sector workers need to also be sensitive to the state of the economy. And the point you're making is so correct, that is it possible that they've been seeing or observing, the developments of other sector strike, right? So meaning that, Eskom settled I think the multi-year wage agreement, even though they did say, even in the wage agreement, they actually don't have funding for that wage agreement, right? So I'm assuming that also, the public sector workers are also politically leveraging on the back of some of these other, wage agreements. But the difference is that, South Africa currently wants to manage its public debt. That's the first thing. But also the second issue we also need to plead with the public sector is to be sensitive to the fact that the balance sheet of South Africa is not strong, as one would expect. So in essence, we would really like, some form of sensitivity in as far as the demands are working. at the same time, and I want to make this point very clear, is that I am not discounting the fact that they are entitled to wage increases.
It's a timing and it's a consideration of the realities on ground. So let's stick with that. So government unilaterally offered this 3% wage increase. And we heard from the finance minister last week when he did his budget presentation. But we know that inflation is around 7.5%. Some unions are demanding 10%. And there's a large difference between 3 and 10%, and even that middle of where the inflation figure stands. What do you think is a compromise? What do you think is a figure that can be met? Because I'm worried about the fact that while government is signing these agreements, government is also saying we do not have the ability to fulfill these agreements. So in 6 months, when this wage increase has not been fully put into play, we will be right back where we are with a threat of another strike. So for this particular situation involving the Public Servants Association, where's the middle ground?
It's a very delicate balance. And I suspect the reason that government had actually unilaterally implemented the 3% was hoping that it was using the 3% as a sweetener to kind of like manage the expectations, right, of the workers. But the reality though is that they live in conditions on the ground and the cost of living demands a little bit higher. So in essence, I would think that if government can actually at least push it to about 5.5%, top up with 2.5%, to make it sure that at least that the workers aren't very far off. Because also remember, part of the inflation that we're confronted with is that it's inflation that is related with Ukraine-Russian war. So it's not really a domestic inflation. But at the same time, for me, one of the key things I actually like, though, about the demands of the public sector is that we must make the link between the cost of living. So meaning, if we impose monetary policy austerity measures to workers, the direct link is the cost of living, and then the other ripple effect is that workers are going to be demanding an increased wages, because in essence, they are feeling the pinch because of the increased interest rates on the ground and the fact that they can't sustain their lives. So in essence, there is a possibility that the current inflation may not be for too long. I'm not sure what are the signals that we are getting from Russia-Ukraine peace talks, for instance, but still, it does not take away the fact that actually the workers are actually choking. In fact, one of the other things why workers are actually asking for exactly the inflation-related increase is the cost of public transport in South Africa. The cost of public transport has become so exorbitant. Taxi industry also does not get support. The rail network infrastructure is actually not doing well. So there are plethora of, various economic variables that are linked to the public sector workers, by the way. Yeah. And in fact, South Africa employs about 1.2 million public sector workers. And for us, we actually think that, the numbers are still lower in relation to the pressure, particularly in the public healthcare system, the pressure unto which nurses are subjected into, but also, the working conditions, and including the fact that they're actually not being paid well, but they're often exposed to danger. In fact, the COVID pandemic had shined a very sharp spotlight on the working conditions of the nurses and public healthcare workers.
Okay, so I want you to circle back to something. That is, of course, who would even be involved in this strike. So it's the Public Servants Association, which has actually now given notice, because South Africa has a very sort of strict way in which strikes are meant to happen. And many people are worried about the fact that these are public servants, sector workers, particularly like nurses. Union leaders, one of them has been quoted as saying, "We're not going to picnic, we're going to war. We cannot stop. We're going for a big war, bigger than has ever been seen in the public service." So how big could this strike be? You talked about 1.2 million workers in the public sector in South Africa. So we're talking about nurses, police officers. Who else could be involved?
So it's the public healthcare nurses, it's the police. I like the call. The teachers have said they're not going to get involved because it's exam time for matric exams, and teachers play such a critical role. But I know that, of course, they continue to have an interest. So in essence, you're likely to be expecting between 40 to 50% of public sector workers. And that's why I'm saying that, I mean, even that component really is actually quite big, right? Because you actually would not want any of your public sector workers to go into strike. I mean, look, it's true that the trade unions are actually quite upset and angry at the unilateral implementation of the 2% by public sector, by government in particular in this context, and they would have preferred, a discussion. And I think what government was actually sending a signal is that, in fact, this is a sweetener we have, and we're not able to be to offer, anything else.
Yeah.
So, and I hope that they are going to be able to avoid a protracted strike, because we're going as well into festive season, and festive season is very precarious in several ways. First one, we have a high road carnage in South Africa during this period because people are driving home and they're driving long distances. So you need functioning public sector to be able to attend to emergencies, right? At the same time, there's also a policing system as well. We do get to experience during the festive season a lot of, high organized crime, and it means that the police must always be on the alert. And communities and citizens actually rely on the police. So I hope that really there will be a way of averting this potential mother of all public sector strikes.
So we can talk about it in terms of the potential for citizens, issues around security, as you mentioned, with the police possibly, or even healthcare. But even on the economic scale, it's been difficult for South Africa to really put a number to the figure as to how much strikes have cost the economy this year. Transnet declared a force majeure because of the workers' strike. Eskom strike just compounded the present load shedding issue. But what we know is that lunchtime pickets and nationwide marches are planned for November 10th, which is then expected to go into a full-scale strike. So there are just about 7 or so days in which this could be forestalled. What would a strike of this magnitude mean for South Africa's economy?
I mean, I think, because it's a essential services, right? You may not be able to immediately quantify comparing to strikes that are kind of like directly economically facing, which is your Eskom and your Transnet. So in essence, I mean, the essential services are quite important in that you want to be able to, if you're not feeling well, if after this interview I'm not feeling well, I want to be able to run to a clinic, get the service and be out, in 2 to 3 hours, instead of getting to the clinic and stay there for another 5 hours. I think from a time perspective, I mean, the costs are always quite easy to actually quantify, because then you can always pick up. It means that people will have to build 3 or 4 hours in addition when they go and when they're going for a public service, particularly in clinics. And I think with the police, it's the same thing, because police, by the way, provide several services. When people are looking for affidavits, for example, when there are certain contracts that are in dispute and people can go and sign in an affidavit, etc. So police play an important role as well in the economy, over and above, the crime-related issues, which I think as well they're quite important. So I mean, I think if the public sector is actually planning, midday picketing, it actually signals that they are still quite sensitive and they understand very deeply the type of service they provide. Because I'm sure once they actually become extremely tired of the, government negotiations, they're likely to go into full swing. But the last point I want to make on this one, more often than not, and I think it's some of the lessons we must always, really learn, as particularly governments, is that when the economy is not doing well, amongst the key things that you need to do is to be able to have conversation with your workers so that you're transparent about the balance sheet that they're managing, and that in fact there are certain parameters or agreements that workers and government gets to meet when the economy is not doing well. Because you do see, it's not because, you do see, for instance, in Europe, that when they are on strike, their strikes don't last for a long time, like we do, for example, in South Africa and even other African countries, because they've always have an established system that in fact facilitate conversation much way in advance to manage expectations, but also to make it sure that in fact, some of the workers' demands, get channeled and, in an appropriate way. But also they get to be listened to much more, earlier, that you don't even wait for this antagonistic, threat of, going to war, public strike, that is intended at crippling the economy. So fundamentally, strikes in the country, protracted strike in different sectors also reflects number of things. Firstly, they reflect the issues around social inequality and the structural poverty. They reflect poor leadership, and on both sides. In that, more often than not, when there's a better coordination around industrial conversations and where the state of the economy is, in fact, you have then limited, tension that arouse from the workers' side, because they would have had access to information in advance.
All right, and I'll end sort of circling back to the beginning. There are a few days before the lunchtime pickets and nationwide marches, and you talk about a conversation, government being transparent. Some would even say this number of strikes also leads to the fact that union workers and people around the country don't even trust government, and what government says is not taken for the truth. Do you think we'll be able to forestall this strike? There are a few days ahead. Government has says it only has 3%. It doesn't even know where it's going to get that 3%, but that's what it has. Will this strike actually hold, or will be able to find some kind of compromise between the Public Servants Association and government?
Look, there's a possibility for a compromise, but I'm not an insider, so I really don't sit in the bargaining council. So I'm not able to really entirely suss out in terms of what are the, what's the climate of negotiation and what are the possibilities between the different parties. But it's possible that, the public sector workers might probably, pursue their, first round of strike, right? And government is going to make an assessment in as far as the impact of the strike and the response of citizens. Because remember, because it's an essential service, so immediately when public sector, strike workers go to strike, citizens are affected directly. So they're going to make an assessment. And I think once they assess the impact, they're likely going to say either let's come back into the table, or if the impact is actually assumed to be minimal, they're likely to, open up without a conversation, which would be, by the way, would not be a wrong approach, and it won't be demonstrating a very strong leadership.
All right, so unfortunately, we're going to have to wait for time to see how all of this plays out. Felisa, thank you so much for your time today. I guess we'll say fingers crossed and eyes waiting and watching to see if this can be averted. Very much so. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And as I said earlier, South Africa has experienced a number of strikes this year, costing the economy millions, but this one would be different. The Public Servants Association represents teachers, nurses, police officers, but the teachers union have said they will not take part because of exams coming up. But what would it mean for South Africa if police and, of course, nurses were to go on strike? There are a few days before the November 10th deadline in which lunchtime pickets and, of course, protests will start. Let's see what happens between now and then. You're watching Business Edge. When we come back, we're getting into international business news for you. After that, we are in West Africa, where the second largest economy on the continent, or rather in the region, I beg your pardon, is experiencing tough times. More after this.